When I saw the job post, I thought it was a joke. The pay was listed at $100 an hour, which seemed like way too much for a security guard position, and to be honest, I thought it was a typo. However, I applied for the job anyway, and the following day I was contacted by a man named Dave, who had written the job post and seemed overly grateful to have someone apply to the position.
Is this Jonas?
I could hear clanging in the background of the call, and it sounded like Dave was somewhere outdoors or something. Yeah, this is me, I replied.
Awesome. This is Dave. I'm calling you about the security guard position that you applied for. I was wondering if you're still interested in the job, and if you'd like to meet for a quick interview.
I was honestly surprised to get a call back that soon, especially since I had been applying to jobs for weeks now and kept getting rejected. Sure, that sounds good. Where would you like to meet?
Thank you so much, Jonas. I'll text you the address. It's a coffee shop. I don't have an office right now. Does 3 p.m. work for you?
I glanced at my watch. It was only noon, and I had nothing planned for the day, so I agreed to meet him, and less than 2 minutes after the call, Dave texted me the address to a coffee shop that was a 10-minute drive from my apartment. Once I arrived, I sat down at one of the tables outside the shop. There was nobody else around except for a woman who was sitting near the door, reading a book. A couple of minutes later, a man walked up to the table and waved at me.
Are you Jonas?
He asked. I nodded.
I'm Dave. Nice to meet you.
Dave was a tall man, much taller than I, with hair that was so blonde and so perfectly slicked back that would probably hold its shape in a rainstorm. He wore a navy suit that was slightly too small for him. The sleeves ended a few inches above his wrists, and his pants a few inches above his ankles, showing his black socks. He wore a navy shirt with a bright yellow bow tie and carried a briefcase that looked empty. We shook hands and he took a seat across from me.
So I'm just going to jump right in and explain the position a little more if that's alright with you.
He set the briefcase down on the ground near his feet and clasped his hands together, setting them down on the table. Sure, that sounds good to me, I agreed.
Very well then. The job requires you to guard a building 5 nights a week from 9 p.m. to midnight. There are some rules and regulations you'll need to follow that I can fill you on later if you decide to take the job.
Dave spoke fast as if he were in a rush, and I tried to concentrate on what he was saying. What exactly will I be guarding? I asked. Dave cleared his throat and looked around a few times.
Have you heard of a restaurant called Cheeky's?
He asked. I shook my head.
It shut down about 2 years ago. Anyway, one of the locations is still owned by the company. It was the very first Cheeky's that ever opened, and they need some extra security for the building.
His explanation seemed vague, and he seemed like he was on edge, or trying to avoid getting into any specifics. Oh, are people trying to break in or something? Why do they need extra security for a building that isn't being used? I asked. Dave sighed and let out a short laugh that was forced.
Something like that.
Confused, I decided to stop asking about the specifics of the company, trying to ignore the red flags. I needed the job badly. I noticed on your job post that the pay was listed at $100 an hour. Was that a typo? I asked, changing the subject.
Oh no, that was not a typo. We want people who will take this job seriously and go above and beyond to assure the building is secure,
Dave said, his mood flipping in an instant. After hearing that, it was as if the weirdness from earlier had never happened. I was not about to turn down a job that paid me that much, even if my employer was a bit odd.
So what do you think?
Dave asked after a few minutes of silence.
Do you still want the job?
Yes, I replied without giving it a second thought.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much, Jonas. I'll send you your schedule and the location of the building tomorrow morning.
He extended his hand and shook my hand aggressively. Thank you for meeting me, I replied as we both stood up.
No, thank you for taking this position. You don't know how great this is for me.
We parted ways after saying a quick goodbye, and I drove back home, thinking back to Dave and his weirdness at the start of the interview. I tried to think of reasons as to why the pay was so high, while the details of the job were so secretive, and after a while, I decided that being a security guard for an old restaurant was a front, and at this point, I was more than okay with that. The following morning, I received an email from Dave that contained the address to the building that I was to be guarding, as well as a work schedule for the next week. After I verified my availability, I sent Dave an email back, asking him about the training for the job. He replied about an hour later, only to tell me that somebody named Brandon would fill me in on my first day. My first day was a week later, and I made the 20-minute drive to the location, and got there about 10 minutes before my shift. The building was surrounded by a chain link fence that had one gate towards the front of the property, and about a dozen no trespassing signs. I parked outside the fence to the right, where there were 2 other cars that I assumed belonged to the workers. I then walked through the gate, making sure to shut it again behind me. The building itself was rather large, a lot larger than I would have expected for a restaurant. All of the windows had been boarded up with large pieces of wood, some of which had been vandalised recently and contained phrases like "get out" and "beware." I rolled my eyes and began thinking that maybe the owners were simply overly paranoid and wanted to ward off some stupid kids that were treating it like this place was a haunted house. The old cheeky sign was still at the top of the building, although it was faded and broken now. You could barely even see the name of the place, and there was an animated yellow dog on the side of the sign. Presumably the Cheeky's mascot that had been vandalised as well, with black X's painted across the eyes. The area around the building was mainly dirt, with random patches of overgrown grass and weeds. It was pretty dark out, and the only source of light was 2 lampposts in the front of the building, and a light coming from the outside of the trailer that was parked behind the building. I made my way to the trailer and knocked on the door. A slight breeze rattled the fence behind me, and I looked around, feeling a bit spooked. I could hear movement coming from inside the trailer, and then the door was opened and a guy stuck his head out of the trailer to look at me. He had long hair and a tattoo of a bird on the side of his neck. "Are you Jonah?" he asked. "Jonas," I corrected. He looked at me and shrugged. "Sure," he replied, stepping aside to let me in. I climbed up the 2 steps into the trailer and looked around. It was mainly empty, except for a small table with a microwave on it, 3 chairs, a mini fridge, and a bathroom. There was another guy sitting to the left of the trailer, in front of 3 computer screens that showed security footage from multiple areas around the building. There was a 4th screen in the left corner that was off, and had an orange sticky note on it that said, "Out of order." "Hey Mark, this is Jonas," the first guy said, reaching over to the table to grab a steaming cup of ramen. "You're early," Mark replied. He was bald and had a scar on the left side of his face. "Yeah, I like to be early," I said. Mark turned around and nodded, looked at me for a few seconds. "Brandon is going to show you around a bit and give you some info about the job." I nodded and turned to look at Brandon, who was blowing on his noodles. He sighed and stood up as he shoved a forkful of noodles in his mouth and motioned for me to follow him. He handed me a flashlight, which I turned on, and then I followed him out of the trailer, shutting the door behind me, and then we began walking around the back of the building. "The job is pretty simple. You just sit in the trailer most of the time, and we take turns doing rounds every hour, just to make sure no one is sneaking in here." Brandon continued to eat his ramen as he walked. It was pretty dark outside, and I swept the light around the area, but I saw nothing. The building was located in a semi-secluded area, a couple of miles off the main road, and there didn't seem to be many houses nearby either. I looked out past the fence at the trees and bushes nearby, but the night was empty and silent, except for the sound of our footsteps crunching on the dry grass. "Now, there's a couple of rules that we have to follow, so listen up. You listening?" he asked, looking at me. I nodded. "Good. Rule number 1, do not wear bright colors. Dark clothing only." He motioned up and down at his all-black outfit, and I nodded as I waited for him to continue, as he slurped up some more noodles. "Rule number 2, we must do 1 perimeter check every hour. No excuses. We do one at 10, then 11, and then the last is at midnight right before we leave. Do not leave until the last perimeter check is complete. Got it?" "Got it," I replied. We were on the other side of the property now, opposite the trailer, and we stopped walking. Brandon looked around the darkness, and I watched as a noodle that was halfway out of his cup fall on the dirt. Behind him, something rustled in the trees. "Rule number 3 is the final and most important rule of all time," he said, pointing his fork at me. "No matter what happens, you cannot, under any circumstances, go inside Cheeky's." I glanced at the building. There was a door on the side with "Exit" painted on it in red letters. It appeared to have been done recently, as the paint looked fresh and wasn't faded like the signs out in the front. "You got it?" Brandon asked. "Loud and clear," I replied. "Good." He began walking back to the trailer and I followed him. As we made our way back, I heard a banging sound that seemed to come from the other side of the building. I stopped walking and aimed the flashlight toward the sound, but there was no one there. I was beginning to feel nervous, being out here basically in the middle of nowhere at night. There was very minimal light, and I assumed that not many people knew we were out here. I started to wonder how long it would take the cops to get to us in an emergency. "Come on," Brandon called, snapping me out of my thoughts. I sped up and caught up to him as he took long and quick strides towards the trailer. Mark was still sitting in his usual spot when we returned, looking at the computer screens as he flipped a pen in his fingers. "How'd it go?" he asked, without looking back. "It was great," Brandon replied. He drank all the broth from his noodles and then tossed the cup back on the table. "Well, there's not much else to do. You can take the second shift for the perimeter check at 11. Until then, make yourself comfortable, I guess," Mark said. I sat down in the last empty chair and stared at the screens. There was nothing going on, and I wondered why they needed 3 people to guard an old building that wasn't even being used anymore. "What exactly are we guarding?" I asked, after a few minutes of silence. Mark glanced back and looked at Brandon. "The building," Brandon replied as Mark chuckled. Come on, there's no way they're paying 3 people $300 a night to guard a building.
It's 'cause it's haunted,
Mark replied.
Seriously?
I asked. He laughed.
No.
I sighed, annoyed at their lack of an answer.
There's something inside the building,
Brandon said.
I don't know what it is, but it's something important. That's why they pay us so much.
Drugs? I asked. Brandon shrugged.
Maybe.
Neither of the guys seemed like they were interested in having a conversation, and so we spent the rest of the time in silence. And at 10 PM, Brandon got up to do the perimeter check. I watched him on the security footage as he made his way around the building, shining the light around the area to make sure there weren't any trespassers. I saw him glance towards the building for a split second, shining his light at it like he had heard something. But instead of stopping to investigate, he continued his walk. He came back after 12 minutes and sat back down in his chair.
Looks good,
he said as he pulled out his phone. As I sat in the trailer, I started to think about the different things that we could be guarding. There was a good chance it was drugs, but I couldn't figure out why someone would stash drugs at an old restaurant. Do you guys know why the place shut down? I asked, breaking the silence.
Human rights violations,
Mark replied without turning around. What did they do? Mark turned around in his chair, and I noticed the gun that he had on his hip.
A whole bunch of fucked up shit. I've heard a lot of different stories, and I'm sure at least one must be true. I've never asked for specifics. I'm trying to keep this job, and if you are too, then I suggest you stop with the questions, he said.
Alright, I replied.
A guy went missing,
Brandon said after a few seconds. I turned to look at him. He turned his phone off and put it in his pocket.
Right before Cheeky's closed, there was an employee who went missing during his shift. He was in costume. You know the yellow dog on the sign? He was the one inside of that. There was a whole investigation, and people thought something had happened to him and the company was trying to cover it up, but they never proved anything. Then, like a month later, they just closed all their locations and sold all of the buildings except for this one.
He pressed his lips together and nodded.
It was some crazy shit.
Is that true? I asked. I looked over at Mark, who shrugged and glanced at Brandon.
Like I said, there are a lot of different stories.
Another hour passed by, and then it was my turn to make sure the area was secure. I got up and grabbed the flashlight from Brandon, stepping out of the trailer and into the dark.
Hey!
I turned around to see Mark opening the trailer door.
Take this with you,
he said, handing me a walkie-talkie.
Since you knew.
I took it from him. I made sure it was on before I continued on my way. I was happy to walk around for a bit, considering that I had been sitting for a while and there was minimal room for walking around inside the trailer. I stretched my legs and continued on at a leisurely pace. It was kind of nice to be out in the quiet night if I ignored the looming presence of the building and what was in there. There was a cool breeze that blew through the trees periodically and made the gate clang against the fence. As I was passing the exit door I had seen earlier, I heard another banging sound. Only this time I was certain that it was coming from the inside of the building. I stopped and swept the light around the area, just to make sure there wasn't another source for the noise, but I saw nothing nearby that could have caused it. I thought about taking a peek inside the building, but then I thought back to rule number 3, chose to ignore it, and continued on my way back to the trailer. A couple of seconds later, as I walked past the front of the building, I heard the sound again, only this time it was closer, as if it were coming from right inside one of the windows. "Hello?" I asked. The banging stopped, and I stopped walking as I stood in front of the building, using the flashlight to illuminate it.
"Ow,"
a quivering voice replied.
"Jonas, walk away."
I had forgotten about the walkie in my hand until Mark's voice came crackling through it. "There's someone trapped in the building. I think they might be hurt," I replied.
"No, Jonas, do not open the fucking door. Do not go into the building, do you understand?"
Mark snaps. I was a bit startled by his sudden aggressiveness. Surely if we were meant to guard something of high importance, we shouldn't allow anyone inside the building, right? I stood in place for a few seconds, trying to concentrate and listen for any more sounds that might be coming from the inside of the building. I could hear heavy footsteps and groaning sounds. It sounded like someone was injured. "Listen," I replied. "I don't care what we're guarding or how important it is. I'm not leaving a person in there, especially if they're hurt. I'm going to get them. I'll be out quickly."
"Jonas, I swear to God, ignore what you heard. Come back to the trailer,"
Brandon said. He sounded out of breath, and I heard the trailer door close in the distance, followed by heavy footsteps as they began running towards me. I took off, running back the way I came, and yanking one of the wooden boards on the window, moving it off to the side. I managed to squeeze through the space and fell into the building as the boards slid back into place. I could hear Brandon and Mark right outside.
"You take the exit. I'm going in through the window,"
Brandon said. I heard Mark take off running towards the side of the building, and I turned off the walkie, using the flashlight to look around inside. The inside of the building was disgusting. There were roaches and rats everywhere, some alive and some dead. I stepped on a few dead roaches as I walked, wincing at the crunching sounds echoed through the silence. I kept walking, shining my light around the floor. I made my way further into the building, and then the smell hit me. It was a pungent odour, a revolting combination of smells. I lifted the neck of my shirt up to cover my nose as I kept walking. I passed by a few piles of unidentifiable rotting items, as well as piles of feces and puddles of urine. I gagged, wondering what they could possibly be hiding in this mess, and hid the door open towards the left side of the building.
Jonas!
Mac hissed. I didn't respond and kept walking into the building, looking for the source of the voice.
Where the fuck is he?
I heard Brandon whisper. I stopped walking to shine the light around the inside of the building, but I couldn't see anything.
Jonas, we see you! Get the fuck out of there!
Matt called from behind me. I turned the flashlight off and continued to walk as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. Then I heard the sound of rapid footsteps coming from the other side of the building. They were fast and loud, slapping hard against the cement floor of the building. I jumped out of the way, careful not to lose my balance and fall into a pile of rotting items, or worse. The footsteps sped right past me, and I ran towards the nearest window as I heard a crash.
Holy shit!
Brandon yelled. I could hear the sound of a struggle, and then 2 gunshots.
What the fuck is that?
Brandon yelled.
It's him! It's not dying!
Mark replied. I pushed on the wooden board on the window as I heard a scream, followed by more gunshots. My heart was pounding in my chest as I threw myself against the boarded window, crying out in pain as my shoulder cracked. I was no longer worried about someone being stuck inside the building. I wanted to get out. Finally, I was able to loosen up the board, and I threw myself out the window, rolling onto the dirt outside. I winced as my shoulder made contact with the ground. Then, I crawled back to the window and held my breath to listen. There was nothing but silence coming from the building. I moved closer to the window. There were cracking and chewing noises coming from inside, but I could no longer hear Mark or Brandon. I got up and ran, pushing the gate open and digging in my pocket for my keys. Once I made it to my car, I threw open the door and got in, slamming it shut and locking it as I started the engine. I sat there for a few seconds, waiting to see if Mark or Brandon would come out, but they didn't. Something else did though. It was a man, or someone who was once a man at least. He was tall and completely naked, with small patches of dry, dirty yellow hair that seemed to be coming from his skin. His visible skin was a weird shade of yellow, and his feet and hands were misshapen and larger than a normal human. He was hunched over, his arms dangling towards the ground. I watched as he walked closer to the side of the property that I was parked on. I noticed that his head had been mostly shaved, except for small tufts of the same yellow hair coming out of his head. His ears were gone, and instead, he had 2 large floppy dog-like ears attached to the side of his head. But they were grey and had chunks missing from each ear. It looked like someone had fabricated them out of actual skin that was now rotting. I slowly shifted into reverse and began backing away from the fence. The man saw me and dropped his upper half down so his hands were on the floor. He looked up towards me, and I could see a tail moving around behind him. Then, he started running at me on all fours, full speed. I sped up, violently lurching backward and then forward as I fumbled to shift back into drive. I pressed my foot on the gas as the man leapt onto the gate and began climbing it. I sped away, not looking back until I had been on the road for a few seconds. There didn't seem to be anyone following me, and so I drove, shaking and hyperventilating, until I almost ran out of gas. I spotted a motel, pulled into the parking lot, and got a room for the night, not wanting to go back home. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes I would see that thing, tearing me apart in the motel bed. I checked out the next morning and drove to a gas station across the street to fill up my tank. I decided to keep driving, not wanting to return to town and be questioned by police. I knew it was probably worse to disappear, but I couldn't get the image of the man out of my head. Was he what we was guarding? Had I fucked up? What had they done to him? I thought back to the story that Brandon had told me, refusing to believe that what I had seen was real. How much had they changed about this human? Dogs were good at sniffing people out, right? What if he followed my scent here and killed me? I tried to ignore the paranoia as I walked into the gas station to pay. Once I finished that, I walked back outside to my car. I could see a piece of paper flapping in the wind under my windshield wiper, and I looked around but didn't see anyone around, even though I knew for a fact that the paper had not been there when I left the motel. I pulled it out from under the wiper and scanned the paper. It was a handwritten flyer that read, "Join us for Cheeky's grand reopening next week." Below that was the address of the building I had been at the night before, along with a drawing of the yellow dog.